STEM is the future. The arts and the humanities are subjects that have become increasingly outdated in today's rapidly advancing society. We need more computer scientists, doctors, and engineers. We don't need any more philosophy or gender studies majors. But why do we think this way? What about our society makes us think that the humanities are useless? Over the past few decades, the liberal arts has become under increasing amounts of scrutiny from all sorts of directions. Some people claim that the humanities are elitist and overanalyze simple concepts like race and gender. Then there are those who believe that the humanities are inferior subjects because they don't produce rapid technological innovations. On top of that, students aren't incentivized to take humanities courses because college is grossly unaffordable. I mean, when you're drowning in debt after graduation, that library job simply is not going to help you pay the bills. Society doesn't provide us with a single incentive to get a degree in the humanities. But why is this the case? Western society prides itself so much on its great thinkers, like Aristotle and Rousseau. So why don't we incentivize more great thinkers? Why are institutions so adamant on defunding the liberal arts? In this video, we are going to try and answer these questions by doing a deep dive into the shifting role of the humanities in American history and the connections with capitalism, racism, and elitism in academia.
Who has ever been in a situation when they've been like, I really need a gender studies major here to sort this out?
Let me just tell you, it was a completely useless degree.
They're not actually doing something that people need.
We're not going to teach you any of the skills that are in demand in the real world.
Where basically you learn to speak woke, where you learn how to put pronouns in your Twitter bio.
And the only way to fail is by saying a woman has a vagina.
And they learn very quickly what the free markets suddenly mean.
If you're majoring in STEM, you should go to college. But
So it's up to everyone, parents, teachers, doctors, and anyone with a working brain,
is to make sure that you are getting a return on investment for whatever degree you decide to get.
and for God's sake, get rid of gender studies as a major.
Before we get into this video, I want to clarify that I am speaking from an American perspective. This video might not apply to all of you, but I hope you guys still find it interesting. And of course, if you guys aren't subscribed to my channel, please do that. And I also have a Patreon. You can support me there and help me get a different mic that I don't have to put a sock on top of. But yeah, enjoy the video. In our textbooks, we are often taught to revere great thinkers. Let's take MLK, for example. We are taught that King was a pioneer in the American civil rights movement, fighting against segregation and discrimination against African Americans. Hell, we have a whole government holiday dedicated to him, even though Reagan did it to get the black vote, but that's a different story. MLK's works and legacy are a core part of our American history curriculum. But what we fail to recognize is that he wasn't the peaceful pacifist that our textbooks like to make him out to be. He wasn't somebody that united black and white people by holding hands and singing Kumbaya. King posed an active threat to the establishment. FT Signifier, one of my favorite video essayists, articulates this point really well in his video. It's like one of his most popular videos. So check out that video if you want to learn more about MLK's whitewashing. Anyways, what you might not know was that the CIA had actually spied on King to try and discredit him as a black leader. This just goes to show that the people that the current establishment reveres and celebrates were once the people that the establishment sought to get rid of. Thus, the legacy of many great thinkers have been whitewashed. Now, this may seem like common sense, but great thinkers challenge the existing systems in place. There's no progress without critical analysis, yet critical analysis is deemed woke and unproductive. One of the reasons why the humanities is discredited is because of the linear view we have of history and progress. The linear view of history portrays mankind as continually progressing through the passage of time. This theory of history arose during the Enlightenment, which was a period of rapid technological and philosophical advancement. It oversaw the decline of absolute monarchies and centralized kingly authorities. While this may seem like a positive framework of historical analysis that incentivizes society to continually progress, I would argue that it's problematic. While the Enlightenment promoted ideas of humanism, social progress, and liberty, it was simultaneously used to justify a new wave of imperialism that completely went against its stated liberal aims. The Age of Exploration was an age of new imperialism. It took place in the 15th and 17th centuries and was a direct product of the Enlightenment. Europeans sought to advance their society through exploration and violent conquest. They needed the resources to be able to grow their society, so they exploited those of the Third World. In their attempts to, quote, advance modernity, they ended up violating the autonomy and progress of people all around the globe, from the Americas to Africa and Asia. And I wouldn't necessarily characterize this as progress. If anything, isn't the subjugation of one people by another inherently backwards? Our textbooks espouse an idealized and romantic view of the Enlightenment as this grandiose historical event that pushed Western society towards modernity and democracy. But this isn't exactly the case. Coming out of the Middle Ages, Enlightenment thinkers idealized the Roman Empire as the pinnacle of democracy and civilization. In her article on colonialism and imperialism, Ignoring Medieval History, Dr. Eleanor Janega explains how the Enlightenment movement distorted the historiography of the medieval period and romanticized the Roman Empire to justify the imperialism of the modern age. Quote, "Remember how you were taught how great Rome was? How it was a democracy, how they had wonderful technology and underfloor heating. Oh, isn't that temple beautiful? Yeah, that's because you were being inculcated to think that the ends of imperial violence justifies mass enslavement and disenfranchisement. In reality, Rome wasn't some sort of grand free democracy. Only a tiny percentage of Romans could actually vote. Women of any station certainly could not, and even men who were lucky enough to be free weren't necessarily Roman citizens." Freedom here is particularly important because by the 1st century BCE, 35 to 40% of the population of the Italian peninsula were slaves. We are centuries past the Enlightenment, but to this day, we still glorify the Roman Empire in our history textbooks and our day-to-day lives. I mean, there was a whole TikTok trend asking guys how often they thought about the Roman Empire. This is because, like the imperialists of the Renaissance, we also glorify old empires to justify the current ones. Our history textbooks are heavily propagandized to justify the ethos of American imperialism. The Romans were seen as the founders of democracy despite their heavily enslaved population. Likewise, the United States loved to call themselves a free and fair democracy, while simultaneously overthrowing democratically elected leaders on the other side of the world because they got in the way of American economic interests. Western powers claim to be the arbiters of democracy and freedom, but are constantly undermining this statement. For example, the US overthrew the democratically elected President Jacob R. Benz when he introduced fair labor laws that threatened to decrease the profits of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. So what does this have to do with our treatment of the humanities? While we are taught the liberal arts in most public schools, the curriculum is heavily propagandized because of the system we live under. We are taught about history as a story of humanity's progression through time. With this framework, radical change is discouraged because we are taught that time will heal, and eventually, history will absolve the problems of society through the liberal democratic process. But this is simply not the case, and is deeply ahistorical. We got the 8-hour workday largely in part of the Haymarket riots. We got affordable school lunches because of the food programs of the militant Black Panther Party. We are taught that humans learn from our past mistakes and that we're continually seeking to progress ourselves. Yet we are currently witnessing a genocide unfold before our very eyes, and we are seeing media outlets hardly covering it at all. One of the reasons why American society hates the humanities is because the government fears a conscious people who can critically analyze the nation-state and its functions. Now, I don't think this is some grand conspiracy to demonize the humanities. It's simply a product of our oppressive state. It's a product of our market-oriented society. I mean, if you think about it, would the state incentivize someone to take classes that challenge their legitimacy, that challenge their hegemony? Private colleges in America operate like companies, and despite their non-profit titles, they make decisions based on market trends. So because of a lack of incentive, underfunding, and societal pressures, you get thousands and thousands of business majors and comp-sci majors graduating every year. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to hate on all STEM students. Science is responsible for an incredible amount of progress in our day-to-day lives. But technological innovation without an understanding of the humanities is the reason why we have automated art before we've automated hard labor. Progress for the sake of progress can often be destructive. It's one of the reasons why we created the atomic bomb. Yes, it's progress, but it's heavily destructive. It doesn't serve an actual humanitarian purpose, obviously. It's the reason why we have unchecked AI video generating software that can literally be used to create disgusting videos of children. Ah yes, man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. So one of the main criticisms that the conservative media loves to perpetuate to invalidate the humanities is vapid anti-intellectualism. And I know what you guys are all thinking. And I feel it too as I'm recording this video. The term intellectual evokes a visceral reaction in me. It evokes an air of superiority and classism that seems tone-deaf. But there's a historical reason why we have this reaction. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, American capitalism has idealized the practical man. The man who gets things done without asking his boss, without questioning the system that exploits his labor. However, while capitalism is one of the main perpetrators of this mindset, anti-intellectualism arose centuries before the Industrial Revolution, and actually arose during the Scientific Revolution. This was a period during the second half of the Renaissance that approached the natural world through the scientific method. Instead of philosophizing Socratically about the world and the heavens, these new scientists adopted a more hands-on approach, a more methodical approach. I'm sure my younger audience is familiar with the scientific method because it remains the first chapter of nearly every high school science course. You start with an observation, create a hypothesis, experiment, analyze your data, and then you report your conclusions. It's thanks to the scientific revolution that we've advanced so far in modern medicine and technology. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad I don't have to worry about dying every time I catch a cold, but the scientific method has garnered an almost cult-like following in the past few centuries. In their article, Ibanga v. Ikpe argues that following the scientific revolution, there was a new obsession with what they call scientism that replaced the old philosophical mode of thought. Auguste Comte, the 18th century philosopher and mathematician, believed that all knowledge should be derived from the human senses. The Enlightenment philosopher David Hume rejected metaphysics, which is a study of the abstract and the nature of reality, because he believed that abstract concepts couldn't be observed with the physical senses and thus it didn't deserve his time. In the article, The Folly of Scientism, Austin Hughes claims that ever since the scientific revolution, there's been a tendency for scientists to overreach because they have been put on what is essentially a pedestal. He claims that, quote, "It is frequently claimed that natural sciences does or soon will constitute the entire domain of the truth. And this attitude is becoming more widespread amongst scientists themselves. Too many of my contemporaries in science have accepted without question the hype that suggests that an advanced degree in some area of natural science confers the ability to pontificate wisely on any and all subjects. This is extremely relevant to the present day, with authorities on science and math commonly spouting nonsense about the social world because of their authority on one domain of study. I mean, I even see my friends in the humanities falling for scientism themselves, justifying history as a legitimate field of study because it's a, quote, science. But, in my opinion at least, a field of study doesn't have to be a science to be legitimate. History isn't a formula. It is precisely this unbridled authority of the sciences that have led to things like scientific racism. They have been given the authority to speak on matters like race and disability and have dehumanized the people that they studied. Humans were treated like livestock, and disabled people and people of color were sterilized or killed for the sake of scientific progress. Of course, the authority of the sciences wasn't the only reason why eugenics became so popular. It was just a science that conveniently aligned with the aims of the state machine to colonize and conquer, but it was still a complacent role in the system. This formulaic approach of cause and effect, hypothesis and experiment cannot fully be used to describe the human condition. It is something that is abstract in nature. This is why many scholars of the humanities study metaphysics, which literally means to study beyond the logic-oriented scientific method. This way of thinking asks questions like what the nature of existence is, questions that really don't have any definitive answers. The scientist tells us that love is a chemical reaction, But love manifests in different ways, in different cultures and languages, in different contexts, and with different people. A few centuries after the scientific revolution, the Western world was transformed during the Industrial Revolution, and Adam Smith came out with The Wealth of Nations during this period. Production was reorganized to adhere to market trends, and society became increasingly concerned with filling the pockets of wealthy oil barons and tycoons of industry. While the scientific revolution did substantially contribute to scientism, the Industrial Revolution took this concept and maxed it out. I'm sorry, I have no other way of saying it. Now, not only was science being substituted for the humanities, but instead of advancing society for the sake of human progress, its new goal was to fill the pockets of industrial capitalists. Science was increasingly decentralized from producing goods that weren't profitable, and thus scientific and societal progress were hampered by this fact. Now, what does this all have to do with anti-intellectualism? Going back to the concept of the practical man, a man who doesn't ask his boss questions, the archetype that arose during the Industrial Revolution also contributed to this anti-intellectual movement. The cult of scientism, in combination with the increasingly profit-centered state of the economy, has made the pursuit of the humanities almost obsolete. But science needs the humanities, and the humanities needs the sciences. It's precisely this segregation of fields that hampers societal progress. You see, following the Cold War, the American universities became increasingly departmentalized. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, universities profit immensely from research projects, especially when they are hyper-specialized and hyper-specific. If a researcher from one university discovers a unique gene splicing method, that university is the one that profits from the research. Now, Adam Smith himself stated that the division of labor and specialization is a means of increasing profits. Once again, it's research for the sake of profit and not research for the sake of human advancement. What is the point in all this? Is this even science? But that aside, hyperspecialization and departmentalization has segregated these fields from one another. Rarely ever is an interdisciplinary approach encouraged in academia, and this causes so many unnecessary issues and hurdles. For example, as a history major, I've noticed that a lot of people in my field specifically who solely take a historical approach to the human condition can often end up dehumanizing the people that they study. Maybe if history students are required to take sociology or philosophy courses, for example, we wouldn't have so many war glorifiers amongst our ranks. People that see war as a game and don't see the humanity in these atrocities. If psychiatry majors were able to take sociology courses, maybe they wouldn't be prescribing stimulants to anyone who seems remotely distracted. An understanding of family and culture can go a long way when it comes to medicine. I mean, aside from interaction within the humanities, you don't see almost any interaction between the science and the humanities departments. And this holds us back so much, which leads me to my next point, which is the issue of academia.
Hey guys, Editing Mika, coming to you live from my dorm. Just to give a little update, I have currently been at my college's pro-Palestine encampment to try and pressure our university to divest in Israel's apartheid regime and genocide in Gaza. And this next segment, I'm basically going to be talking about academia's lack of engagement with the real world. And obviously that's still an issue, right? But these past few days, as we've seen at Columbia, NYU, Emory, and CCNY, academics have been really coming out of their bubble, and I just wanted to commemorate that. They have been putting their careers and lives on the lines for their students. There have been countless arrests of intellectuals, and it's honestly alarming because historically, when academics start getting targeted, the state slowly devolves into fascism, and I'm sure you guys are all keeping up with the news right now. I just wanted to thank all the faculty at the universities that have been coming out in support of their students in these encampments, putting their careers, putting their lives on the lines. This part of the video, this is not about you guys. This is just about like historical precedent.
Now, you may be asking, academia, aren't higher education institutions the main proponents of the humanities? They used to be, for sure. But the privatization of American schools has recentered their goal from a place of cultivating thought to what's essentially a job training institution. Of course, it's great that colleges have become less, at least overtly, segregated in their admission process, and I don't seek to glamorize the past, but history, as I stated before, isn't linear when it comes to progress. Oppression persists within the academic hierarchy, it just takes on a different shape and language, as it does throughout society. Now, one of the more overlooked aspects of why the humanities is becoming obsolete is because of the elite nature of intellectuals in academia. And I know what you guys are thinking. Weren't you just hampering on anti-intellectualists a few minutes earlier? Yes, I am fervently against anti-intellectualism. I believe that the study of the humanities should be encouraged and accessible, but critiquing the academic establishment isn't a form of anti-intellectualism at all. In fact, I would argue that academics are some of the main perpetrators of this anti-intellectualism. Hear me out, guys, because I know it's a bold claim. Academia is notoriously one of the most backwards institutions in this country due to its virtually unclimbable social ladder. To add to that, universities have a history of discriminating against women and people of color. And they have a really bad record when it comes to exploiting their researchers. Some claim that the chance of becoming a tenured professor at a university is statistically less likely than becoming an NFL player. Now, I'm not hampering on the faculty and the PhD students. You guys are the backbone of the university, and I love you all, especially adjuncts, which basically run my institution. The people I'm referring to are the people at the top of the academic hierarchy. The scholars that isolate themselves in their ivory towers and examine society from afar without even caring to interact with it. A lot of academics don't engage with the public or the people that they study because it's easier to stay in your academic bubble. Papers are published on paywalled websites, research is shared at academic conferences, and lessons are taught to those who can afford college. Many academics sit in their office pursuing truth for the sake of truth, while genocides are happening on the ground below them that they can't even muster up the courage to call a genocide. This is because the nature of academia is inherently exclusionary and decentivizes any actual critique of society. Academia under capitalism has conditioned researchers to become super hyper-individualistic in their pursuit of truth and their career goals. I was talking to my friend the other day after my Soviet history class. Big shout out to Nate for this brilliant point. But anyways, he was telling me how being a university student used to be treated as a public service. You used to go to university to learn to improve your own society and your country. Thus, many public universities in its early stages were free. But now, American universities, public or private, are for-profit institutions. Advisors call college an investment that you make. Because yeah, you do accumulate a lot of debt, but it gives you a leg up in the marketplace a few years later. People now choose their college degrees based on which one will be able to pay off the debt that they get from taking on the degree, which is a crazy concept. Literally, what does it achieve? It doesn't make any sense. It's a cycle of debt for the sake of what? The reason why so many public universities started charging an absurd amount of tuition is because of Ronald Reagan. People now have to take out loans to attend public institutions. When Reagan was the governor of California in the late 60s, the climate of the country was intense. And the governor was fervently against the growing leftist movement in the country, because of course he was. America was spending its taxpayer money fighting its relentless war against communism on the other side of the globe. And a large portion of the American community became disillusioned with their government, especially amongst the younger populations. The advent of new technology like televisions exposed the dark truth about the kinds of war that America was fighting. And students became increasingly agitated with their government. For example, I'm sure you guys have heard about the anti-war protesters during the Vietnam War and the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s. But while they're heavily documented, these weren't the movements that threatened the establishment. These weren't the movements that scared government officials like Ronald Reagan. Are you just gonna be here, Mozart? For the rest of the video, you have something to say, Mozart? About the state of dogs? The heart of the labor movement in 20th century America was actually led by armed student revolutionaries. In 1966, the Black Panther Party was established by college students, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers were heavily inspired by global socialist revolutions, and they didn't believe that reform through the liberal democratic process would alleviate the violent oppression of Black working-class people, especially by the hands of the police. So they advocated for armed self-defense against the violent police force of Oakland, California. And they simultaneously protected their community through food and education programs. In the late 60s and 70s, the ideas of the Black Panther Party and armed socialist revolution began to spread throughout campuses around the country.
And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
The student body became an increasingly militarized force, and students began to form picket lines and threaten the state's power. According to an FBI memo, Reagan, quote, was dedicated to the destruction of disruptive elements on California college campuses. He was particularly against the student protests and the left-wing activism at UC Berkeley. So as the governor of California, Reagan both politically pressured the institution into charging tuition and simultaneously introduced major budget cuts to further pressure them into doing so. Reagan chose to do this because he desperately wanted to root out left-wing activism and labor movement, especially amongst Black and brown students in university curriculums. In Reagan's own words, his goal was to, quote, get rid of the undesirables. Those who are there to carry signs and not to study might think twice to carry picket signs. Thus, in 1970, UC Berkeley introduced its tuition. Reagan and his neoconservative goons were thus able to filter out left-wing activism through classism. They discriminated against poor people because they were the ones who were most likely to protest. Subsequently, academia and the university institution became increasingly discouraged with partaking in any sort of political activism and radicalism on campus. While university used to be treated as a public service, people who now attend university are going to them for hyper-individualistic purposes. Students go to university for their own economic advancement. Researchers in academia produce research for their own sake, and often end up sabotaging their fellow workers in what's essentially a dog-eat-dog process. A place that used to bring students together in solidarity is now one that encourages academic toxicity and a hyper-individualistic mentality, one that can feel super alienating and isolating. I saw a meme the other day that said that in a decade or so, the same institutions that have been violently suppressing Palestinian protesters will be publishing articles titled, quote, The Gender Dynamics of the Palestinian Diaspora, The Implications of Genocide and Settler Colonialism, or something. Institutions can't condemn the genocide in Gaza because they profit from Israel's apartheid. Columbia University, for example, has been violently suppressing pro-Palestinian protesters because they have stocks, funds, and partnerships with the Israeli state. They've been banning pro-Palestinian organizations and have refused to divest their funds from these groups. The very least they could do is condemn the war crimes of the IOF to put some kind of pressure on their government to stop the genocide, but it's simply not profitable. In this sense, there is a tragic and ironic disconnect from the humanities from humanity. There is a fundamental dissonance within academia that holds up the very anti-intellectualism that they swear against. There's a lack of engagement with real people that could benefit from academic research. It's easy to talk about past genocides because you're disconnected from it. You can observe it from afar and shake your head at it. It's easy to write books on fascism, racism, and imperialism. It's easy to criticize society. But what's not so easy is to act against these criticisms. Academia has shut itself off from the world that they study. They have become so exclusionary that I would say it's become its own esoteric tradition, sharing coveted knowledge only amongst their contemporaries, amongst the educated elite. And this is part of the reason why I post YouTube videos. Trust me, I don't see myself as some great arbiter of truth. I'm just a college student seeking to advance my own knowledge. But I want to make knowledge accessible to everyday people. I don't want to produce research that's only read by a few academic elites in their office. Information should be public, accessible to everyone. I've seen memes about how we need less video essayists and more electricians. But no, we need more bloggers, more video essayists. As corny as it sounds, knowledge is power. Don't let those STEM nerds discourage you from getting a women and gender studies degree. These are legitimate fields of study. Turn this video off. The next time a business major tries to tell you that your degree is useless, tell them that at least you're working towards the collective good of society and not to pay a shareholder's new yacht. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you to my patrons who help hold up this channel. I really appreciate it. To the rest of you guys, stay nerdy and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, guys.